History bears witness to the inevitable results of the idealist method. We see not only the failure of Descartes and the results of idealists like Kant and Berkeley, but the failure of those realists who have adopted their method. Not that Gilson considers an historical analysis able to demonstrate the necessary impossibility of a critical realism. Quote, such an approach is necessary yet insufficient, for the fact that 10, 20, or 100 philosophers have failed to find the solution to a problem does not prove that the problem is impossible to solve, unquote. Nonetheless, it is telling that thinker after thinker has failed to solve the problem. Furthermore, in the face of this, the burden of proof lies upon the critical realist. Quote, each time we have discussed some particular form of critical realism and found it lacking, others have always claimed that another form of critical realism might overcome our objections. And if we then demonstrated the insufficiency of the next form of critical realism, still another was trotted out. The partisans of critical realism maintain that this process must continue until it has been proven that their position is impossible as a matter of principle. To this we reply that if those who maintain that critical realism is possible in principle never provide a factual demonstration, it is a bit much for them to demand that their adversaries accept this doctrine on the strength of the promise of future proofs. It is up to them to show that it is indeed possible. While waiting, however, we may occupy our time profitably by demonstrating the inherent self-contradiction involved in each critical realism which has been advanced up to now, and inquiring whether this self-contradiction is not coessential with the very question asked." Unquote. In light of the above considerations, let us consider some of the attempts at critical realism with which Gilson dealt. Gilson tells us clearly, and repeats it often, that, quote, every refutation of an error founded upon the consequences of that very error must inevitably fall back into that same error from whose consequences it took its starting point. Unquote. Some attempts at a critique of the critique are undertaken by well-intended neo-scholastic authors, but all seem to fail because of the premises they accepted from the idealist method they intend to refute. This is because, quote, whoever sticks a finger into the machinery of the Cartesian method must be expected to be dragged along its whole course, unquote. One such well-intended realist is Cardinal Mercier. He posits the method of a mediate realism and attempts to justify the real object of sensible forms through the principle of causality. What the Cardinal wishes to do, one thinks, is to take Descartes' method and avoid ending up with the result of Berkeley. In basic form, he wishes to show that the contingency of the impressions of objects on the senses proves that they are objectively out there, since it is not we who act on ourselves to cause them. Quote, either I am the cause of my sensations, or something other than myself is, unquote. We easily understand that they are not of our own making. The problem is, many other solutions save the appearances, to say the least. Not only Berkeley's idealism, but the occasionalism of Malebranche, parallelism of Spinoza, or the pre-established harmony of Leibniz all explain the data. These positions all imply that the contingent non-self sensations are given from the mind of God, or a similar method, and not from an objective reality out there. It becomes quickly apparent that the principle of causality, merged to the contingent nature of those things which cause sensation, cannot be a legitimate proof of the objectivity of a material world. At best, a material world is merely one possible explanation of the data. We are forced to concede that immediate realism is no realism at all, as it can in no way posit a direct knowledge of the things in themselves, not even being able to prove that there are indeed things in themselves. Gilson then looks at the question of whether realism can be both critical and immediate at the same time. This is viewed under the research of Monsignor Noel, whose thought on the work of Cardinal Mercier gives rise to some confusion in Gilson. Noel claims to be in general agreement with Mercier, and Gilson gives some valid criticisms of this claim. As far as Étienne Gilson is concerned, however, this disagreement between concerning Noel and Mercier's position has no effect on the consideration of Noel's position in itself. The best explanation for some of Noel's alleged agreement with Cardinal Mercier's work is that the Monsignor is able to read into the Cardinal's work his own thought due to some ambiguities on the part of Mercier. The term immediate realism holds that the mind is able to grasp immediately, quote, a reality independent both of the thoughts which it represents and the act of thought that apprehends it, unquote. But what do we make of the critical label here? The critical method seems to require an indisputable certainty. This would imply that some critical starting point precedes the philosophy in question. But if this is so, then the starting point holds itself superior to realism, for it is a starting point that holds epistemology as superior to metaphysics. If being is not first, it cannot become first after a prior principle. This is simply absurd, and realism demands that being be first. Realism then will always start with metaphysics as the judge of all other sciences, since it deals with first principles. Realism, likewise, ought to start with the fact of the existence of things in themselves. Quote, as soon as one accepts the idea of immediate realism, there can, by definition, no longer be a question of the existence of the outside world, unquote. What then is the problem with this so-called immediate realism of Noel? Noel does not truly go straight to the real. He posits an apprehended reality and then starts from the point of the apprehended, so-called. In other words, this immediate realism is, as Gilson describes it, planning to consider in the apprehended real only the apprehended without the reality. What has happened here is a repetition of former problems. We have once again cut ourselves off from reality, only this time at a slightly varied point, and then begin to seek a way back. Quote, put in the simplest terms, the question comes down to what has been called the problem of the bridge, unquote. We keep isolating thought from things, or rather knowledge from things, as if they were two spatially separated objects, and then seeking a way to reunite them, coming up short. Anytime we make such a division, we start from the point of view of the idealist. Here, it is worth repeating, every refutation of an error founded upon the consequences of that very error must inevitably fall back into that same error from whose consequences it took its starting point. Each cutting off of the knowledge of the thing from the thing known will create an unbridgeable divide. The idealist, knowingly or not, always has an advantage in the discussion if we miss this fact. Quote, all idealist objections to the realist position are formulated in idealist terms, so it is hardly surprising that the idealist always wins. His question invariably imply an idealist solution to problems, unquote. Like most philosophies, there is a great coherence, even brilliance, in the system. It all holds together quite nicely as long as we accept just one little absurdity in the beginning. Quote, one is mistaken in trying to refute the idealist systems by accusing it of not being logical enough. On the contrary, it is a doctrine that lives by logic, and only logic, because in it the order and connection of ideas replaces the order and connection between things. One would do well here to turn to, unquote, one would do well here to turn to Gödel's theorem and reflect on its possible implications here.